They called it madness, stepping within striking distance of a wild black stallion, its flanks heaving, its body twisted in rusted barbed wire sharp enough to flay a man's hand open. One kick could end him. Yet when a broke war veteran pressed his cutters against the steel and sheared it loose, the wilderness held its breath. Because what happened in that frozen silence wasn't just about saving a horse. It was about trust forged in fear, survival when everything said, run, and a bond. No one could have predicted a bond that would rewrite the course of Jack Mercer's life. But that night's rescue wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something darker, more dangerous, and more costly than he ever imagined. The Montana high country awoke in slivers of light, the kind that painted the ridgelines in pale silver before the sun gained its bite. The air was sharp, thin enough to sting the lungs, carrying pine resin and damp earth with every breath. Jack's old pickup shuddered along the dirt road, coughing out black exhaust, its rattling frame held together by rust, bolts, and sheer stubbornness, just like the man behind the wheel. In the cracked side mirror, his reflection looked more ghost than flesh, a face creased with years, stubble hiding the lines that war had carved deep, eyes of faded steel blue that once scanned deserts a world away, searching for danger in the tilt of a shadow. Those same eyes now traced deer, slipping through tree lines and stones scattering beneath his tires. Always watching, always alert, Jack lived like the wilderness itself, silent, scarred, and enduring. Town folks had long stopped asking why he stayed alone. He gave them polite nods, a few words at most, but distance was his armor. He spent his days cutting wood, fishing streams, patching the truck with the same stubborn will that kept him alive. Solitude didn't scare him, it steadied him. And yet, in the stillness between breaths, when the forest hushed and the only heartbeat he heard was his own, Jack sometimes wondered how long a man could carry ghosts before they carried him. That morning, though, he didn't know the answer would come galloping out of the trees, wild, black, furious, and tangled in wire. Nor could he guess that freeing the beast would unleash more than trust. It would set in motion a chain of events that wouldn't just test his survival. It would force him to choose between the ghosts he carried and a living, breathing creature determined to drag him back into life or into danger deeper than the wilderness itself. The truck jolted through a pothole, and Jack adjusted his grip on the wheel. He should have felt the comfort of routine, the rhythm of another day alone in the wild. Yet, something was off. He realized it slowly, like noticing a draft in a closed room. The forest was quiet, too quiet. He let the truck roll forward a few more yards before he frowned and turned down the radio, though it was only spitting. Attic anyway. The silence pressed against the cab. No bird song threaded through the branches. No squirrels chattered in the pines. Even the wind, which usually whistled a constant tune through the needles, seemed to have stilled. Jack leaned forward, squinting at the tree-ine. An old instinct stirred in him. In the desert, silence had often meant ambush. In the forest, silence could mean predator, or injury, or death. He slowed the truck foot, easing off the gas, and listened. The rumble of the engine felt intrusive in that hush, so he cut the ignition. The truck coughed once and died. Then the quiet returned deeper than before, and his pulse quickened. He sat there, gripping the wheel, his breath clouding faintly in the chill. The silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. And then he heard it, a sound low and guttural, dragging and broken, as though pulled from the pit of something enormous. It wasn't the creak of a tree or the groan of shifting rock. It was alive, a noise full of strain and pain. Jack's stiffened eyes, narrowing. He held his breath and listened again. That sound came in intervals, a harsh wheeze followed by a rasping moan. The hair rose on the back of his neck. He had heard the dying cries of men before, on sand and stone. And though this sound came from something not human, the echo of suffering was unmistakable. His hand tightened unconsciously on the steering wheel until his knuckles palled. Part of him wanted to turn the key, start the engine, and keep driving until the sound was swallowed by distance. But he knew himself too well. That wasn't who he was, not anymore. Not after everything. Slowly, deliberately, he opened the door. The hinge squealed softly. He winced at the noise, glancing into the tree-in as if it might draw something out. Then he stepped onto the dirt boots, crunching against gravel. The sound came again from somewhere just beyond the road. Jack turned toward it, moving carefully, scanning the shadows between the trees. He passed the hood of the truck and the ditch at the side of the track, following the uneven rhythm of that wheeze and groan, and then he saw it. At first, it seemed like a mass of shadow tangled in the undergrowth, but as he drew closer, details emerged. The shimmer of black hide, slick with sweat, and the flash of a rolling eye. the sharp gleam of barbed wire biting deep. A horse, a massive one. Its coat, once shining, was now matted with dirt and blood. The animal had fought and lost against the cruel embrace of an old barbed wire fence, half collapsed and rusted, left forgotten at the edge of the woods. Loops of steel had wrapped around its chest and forehead, cutting deep, slicing furrows into flesh that wept crimson. The stallion's shuttered muscles twitching under the strain. Each breath came ragged, misting the air. When it struggled, the barbs dug deeper, and it stilled again with a shuddering moan. Jack stopped several feet away, his heart hammering. The animal was magnificent, even broken like this tall, broad, a creature of raw strength and beauty. Its mane hung in clumps, tangled with burrs and stray with blood. The smell hit him then, sharp iron from rust, thick copper from the wounds, and the musky tang of horse sweat. It was a pungent cocktail of life and injury that clawed at his throat. The horse lifted its head weakly, its eyes, dark liquid brown, met his, and Jack froze. He expected wildness there, terror, maybe fury. What he saw instead rooted him to the spot. Pain, yes, and fear. But beneath it all, something else. Desperation. Animals didn't look at people like that, not in his experience. He had spent enough time in these woods to know wild things fought or fled. They didn't plead. Yet, here it was, this, a giant of muscle and sinew, staring at him as though begging for something it couldn't speak. Jack swallowed his, throat dry. His mind raced. Logic screamed at him, "Stay back." This was a wild mustang, trapped and terrified. If it lashed out, one kick could cave in, his chest. He had seen it happen on ranches when he was a boy. He took a step back, and his boots crunching on the dirt, and every survival instinct told him to turn, climb into his truck, and drive until he couldn't hear the sound anymore. That was the smart thing, the safe thing. But his eyes stayed locked on the horses, and memory rose unbitten. Desert heat, the crack of gunfire, the sound of men calling for help that never came. Jack had lived with that guilt for years, the moments when hesitation cost lives. When he had turned away from something he couldn't fix, he knew the weight of walking away. It never left you. His chest tightened painfully. The stallion's sides heaved, its breath whistling weakly. Blood seeped around the wire with every shallow movement. Jack's hands curled into fists at his sides. If he left now, it would die. Slowly, alone, he drew a long breath, steadying himself, though his pulse thundered in his ears. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, the words, half a curse, half a surrender. He glanced back at his truck at the Kelly green toolbox in the bed. Inside was a pair of old wire cutters, dull but serviceable. He had used them to mend fences, to salvage scrap. Never had he imagined they might be the line between life and death for something like this. Jack turned back to the stallion, jaws set. The horse's gaze hadn't left him. Its ears twitched, nostrils flaring, but it didn't thrash as he stepped a fraction closer. He could almost hear his own heart answering that silent plea. If not me, then who? And with that thought, Jack made his choice. He spun on his heel, hurried back to the bed of his pickup, and yanked open the battered and green toolbox that rode there. Inside, under a scatter of old nails and fencing staples, lay a pair of bolt cutters he'd carried for years. The handles were chipped, the hinge stiff with rust, but the jaws were sharp enough. He hefted it, testing the grip, then blew out a long breath. His chest rose and fell heavily, the same way it used to before going through a breached door. Overseas. "All right," he muttered to himself, voice growly in the cold air. "Let's do something stupid." With the cutters heavy in his hand, he walked back toward the trapped horse. Each step was deliberate, slow, his boots pressing softly into the pine and needle carpet. He kept his shoulders low, head slightly bowed, trying to make himself less threatening. He'd learned long ago that animals picked up everything: tone, movement, even intent. The horse noticed him immediately. Its ears snapped forward, then back, then forward again, catching his approach. Its sides heaved, the great chest rose, and fell in ragged rhythm each breath, pulling at the barbs buried deep in flesh. A tremor rippled down the animal's powerful shoulders, and the air filled with the sound of labored breathing. Jack stopped a few feet away, close enough now to smell the copper tang of blood and the earthy musk of sweat. The animal's eyes rolled white, showing all around. Its legs kicked weakly at and the ground. "Easy boy," Jack whispered, voice steady but quiet. "I'm not here to hurt you." For a long second, the stallion only stared, its nostrils, flaring hot breath spilling into the cold morning. Jack waited, holding still. The last yards were the most dangerous. Another wrong step, and fear could explode into violence. Finally, he inched forward, every muscle taut. Now he could see the true damage. Loops of wire cinched around the broad curve of its shoulder, a strand biting cruelly across the ribs, and another, wrapped tight around a foreleg. The wounds were angry, swollen, weeping. Jack set, his jaw raised the cutters, and went for the first strand. The jaws closed with a hard metallic snap. The sound rang through the trees like a gunshot. The horse exploded. It lunged against the fence muscles, convulsing legs flailing. Jack barely had time to jerk back as a hoof soughed through the air, missing his head by inches. He lost his balance, staggered, and nearly went down. The earth trembled under the sudden thrashing of hooves. "Whoa, easy," Jack barked. But the horse wasn't listening. Its eyes went wide with terror foam, flecked its lips, and a high raw scream tore from its throat. Jack scrambled sideways, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Adrenaline roared in his ears. He saw the power in those hooves, the kind of force that could crush ribs like matchsticks. For a moment, panic urged him to drop the cutters and run, but then the stallion sagged again as, though the burst of fury had burned out in seconds. It stood trembling chest, heaving eyes wild but focused on him. Jack pressed his lips together. His hands shook, but he forced them still. "I know it hurts," he whispered voice. "Rough, but steady. But if we stop now, you'll die here." The words weren't for the horse so much as for himself. He couldn't stop, not now. He circled slightly, crouched low, and set the cutters on the next strand, and this one looped around the belly. He pressed down hard. The wire gave way. The horse convulsed, again, jerking sideways. The massive body thudded against the fence post. Jack dove backward, landing hard on one knee. Pain shot up his leg, but he gritted his teeth. Dirt and pine needles smeared across his jeans. The stallion thrashed, muscles rippling under its glossy black coat. Jack's pulse thundered in time with a frantic pounding of hooves. Sweat stung his eyes. It was like playing Russian roulette. Each cut freed the horse, but each cut brought him closer to being killed. Jack pushed himself back up the bolt cutters, heavy in his hands. His breathing was ragged now, shallow and fast. Sweat dripped down his temple, cutting through the grime. He glanced at the animal's eyes again. For a split second, he thought he saw something there. Confusion, maybe even understanding. Then another shudder rippled through the horse, breaking the moment. "Hang on, damn you," Jack muttered, moving toward the worst of it. The deepest strand bit across the horse's chest and forgured in the swollen flesh. It was this wire that had locked the stallion down, tearing muscle with every breath. The sight of it made Jack's stomach twist. He knelt careful, his movement slow as molasses. His hands brushed the horse's damp hide, feeling it flinch. The heat rolling off the animal was intense, mixed with the stink of blood. The horse groaned a low rumble that vibrated through Jack's bones. Its whole body trembled violently, veins standing out under the stretched skin. Hot breath blasted against Jack's cheek as he leaned closer, cutters poised. "Just one more," Jack murmured. His voice cracked under the weight of it. "Hold on." He slid the jaws into place, his fingers tightened around the paws. Handles. For an instant time seemed to freeze the sound of his own heartbeat, the smell of blood, the dark eyes, staring into him. Then he squeezed. The cutters shrieked as steel gave way. The strand whipped loose, snapping back into the brush. Blood surged from the freed wound. The stallion shrieked a guttural roar that split the air. Jack barely had time to throw himself backward as the horse surged forward. Its bulk lunged hooves, gouging deep furrows. For a heart-topping second, Jack was sure it was coming for him. He stumbled, landed hard on his back, breath exploding from his lungs. But the stallion didn't charge. It staggered 2 steps, legs folding beneath it, then collapsed with a crash that shook the ground. The great body rolled once onto its side, heaving blood soaking into the earth. Jack lay frozen where he had fallen, chest heaving sweat, stinging his eyes. He waited for the strike that never came. Finally, he pushed himself up on one elbow, staring in disbelief. The horse lay still, trembling, but unmoving, its breath rattling. For long seconds, neither man nor beast moved. Only the rasp of exhausted lungs filled the clearing. Jack's arms and legs trembled. He wiped a hand across his forehead, leaving a streak of grime and sweat. Slowly, carefully, he sat up, then crouched. His eyes never left the animal. The stallion blinked once, heavy lids lowering and rising. Its eye found him again, but there was no frenzy in it now, only pain, only weariness. The raw edge of panic had drained away, leaving something Jack recognized too well, the look of something too tired to fight anymore. He drew a slow breath. "You're free now," he said softly, his voice ragged. The horse didn't move. Jack swallowed his throat tight. He thought about turning, walking back to his truck. He could drive away. No one would ever know he had been here. But as he looked at the massive body slumped in the dirt, the bleeding, the wounds, the rise and fall of a chest struggling for air, he knew the truth. If he left now, the stallion wouldn't last the night. "You're free," he whispered again, this time almost to himself. Then he added, voice hoarse, "But if I walk away, you won't last the night." The horse exhaled a sound more like a sigh than a growl. Its eye closed halfway, then opened again, still fixed on him. Jack sat back and on his heels, feeling the weight of what he had just done. The decision to cut the wire had been reckless, but the decision that faced him now was worse. Somehow, in freeing the stallion, he had chained himself. Jack stayed crouched in the dirt for a long while after the last strand of barbed wire had been cut. His chest rose and fell in jagged breaths, the bolt cutters heavy and forgotten in his lap. The horse, this massive black shadow of a creature, lay stretched on its side, no longer thrashing, no longer screaming. Its sides shivered as though from cold, though the morning air was crisp, but not yet cruel. Every exhale came with a rattling wheeze. Jack could see blood pooling slowly into the soil beneath the broad chest. He wiped a sleeve across his face, smearing sweat and dirt. He couldn't just sit there waiting for it to die. His gaze flicked toward the truck, parked crooked on the dirt track. There, rattling around in the passenger seat, was a half-empty bottle of water. It wasn't much, but it was something. Jack rose stiffly, legs protesting, and jogged back to the truck. He grabbed the bottle and returned quickly, his boots crunching softly. The horse's ears flicked at the sound, but it didn't move. Didn't even try to rise. Its massive head lay in the pine needles, nostrils, flaring sides, heaving. Jack slowed as he drew near. Every motion now mattered. He dropped to one knee beside the stallion's head, holding the bottle loosely in his hand. "Easy, boy," he murmured the words instinctive. His voice sounded rough, even to his own ears. He twisted the cap open with deliberate slowness. The plastic crackled, the stallion's ears twitched. Jack tipped the bottle, letting a few drops spill onto the dirt in front of its muzzle. For a moment, nothing happened. The horse's eyes were half-lidded, its breathing harsh. Jack's stomach sank. Maybe it was too far gone. Maybe he was only prolonging the inevitable. Then, with a sluggish motion, the great tongue slid out, rasping across the dirt to catch the moisture. Just a flicker of life, but it was enough. Jack felt his chest constrict. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath until it escaped in a shaky rush. "That's it," he whispered. "That's it, big fella. You want it, don't you?" He poured more slowly, letting a thin stream trickle into the soil. The stallion shifted its muzzle weakly, dragging the tongue again. The sound of its soft lapping, wet and desperate, stirred something raw inside. Jack. This was a wild horse, proud, untamed, built to outrun storms and fight off predators. And here it was reduced to this licking at muddy water, trusting him for survival. Jack's throat AHD. He poured a little, more, then dared to bring the bottle closer, tipping it so that the trickle ran in a line that the horse could reach. Without straining, the stallion's lips brushed the earth where the water pulled. It swallowed and then swallowed again, sides rising and falling in shallow rhythm. Jack could almost see the strength returning molecule by molecule. He stayed there, patient, pouring a bit, waiting for the horse to drink, then pouring more. His voice filled the silence between breaths. "Easy there, big fella. I'm not here to hurt you. Just drink." That's right. The words were useless, perhaps. Horses didn't understand English, but something in the cadence seemed to matter. The horse's ears twitched toward him each time he spoke, catching the tone, if not the meaning. Its breathing evened out slightly less ragged. Jack shifted closer, bottle steady. He could feel the warmth radiating off the animal smell. The copper of blood mingled with the earthiness of sweat. It wasn't pleasant, but it was real. Life always smelled like something. By the time the bottle was almost empty, the stallion had taken enough to lift its head, weakly nostrils flaring, its eyes blinked, focusing again. And then, for the first time since Jack had found it. Those eyes settled on him. Not with panic, not with blind terror, but with something quieter. The whites no longer showed starkly. The dark pupils fixed on him steady and unflinching. Jack froze, caught in that gaze. He had expected fury. He had expected the promise of violence. But what he saw now was observation calculation. Like the animal was weighing him, trying to decide what kind of creature he was. Jack's heart pounded. The fragile moment balanced on a knife edge. Any sudden move, any wrong decision, and the trust would snap like the wires he had just cut. He kept still, the empty bottle dangling loosely in his hand. His breathing slowed, trying to mirror calm. "Not going to hurt you," he said softly, barely above a whisper. "Not going to leave you either." The stallion blinked once slow. Jack had seen that look before on wolves, on deer. When they stopped seeing you as predator and started seeing you simply as presence. It was precarious, fleeting, but it was real. Jack stayed like that, unmoving, until the horse lowered its head again, spent, but no longer frantic. He let out a long sigh, sinking onto both knees. His legs trembled from the adrenaline still crashing through him. His mind screamed at him. "It's free now. You've done your part. Walk away." That was the rational path. This animal was no longer trapped. It had water in its belly, air in its lungs. Nature would take its course. But when his gaze drifted to the wounds, deep furrows still bleeding sluggishly, the swollen foreleg that trembled each. The time the horse shifted, he knew the truth. Left here, it would bleed out, or the predators would finish the job, or the cold of night would do what the barbed wire hadn't. Jack closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his lids, memories rose. A desert. Outpost men left behind because it was too dangerous to go back for them. He remembered the way their voices had sounded, growing thinner each minute until silence swallowed them whole. He had lived with that weight pressing on his chest ever since. He opened his eyes to the sight of another living thing staring at him, waiting. No, he thought, not again, not this time. Jack's grip tightened around the empty bottle until the plastic crumpled and creaked. His jaw clenched. "I'm not leaving you here." He whispered the words rough, torn from someplace deep. He leaned closer, his voice firm despite the tremor in it. "Not like this." The stallion exhaled a long, hot sigh that ruffled the dirt between them. Its ears twitched, and it shifted its head slightly, as though acknowledging what had been said. Jack stared, stunned. For a moment, it felt like an answer, like understanding. He pushed to his feet, knees popping, and drew in a lungful of cold mountain air. His hands shook, his body exhausted, but his decision was set. Ahead of him lay the impossible, moving a half-dead and half-tonen animal through the woods to safety. Alone, but behind him lay only one thing, the option of walking away. Jack glanced back once more at the stallion sprawled in the needles. Its eyes followed him, steady, waiting. "All right, big fella," Jack muttered, dragging a hand down his face. "Guess we're in this together." And with that, he turned toward the truck mind, already racing with desperate, foolish plans. He jogged back to the pickup, the bed rattling with every slam of his boots. Digging under a heap of old gear, his fingers found the tarp, faded green canvas frayed at the edges. Beside it lay a coil of rope he'd carried since the service, thick and rough, scarred by years of use. Both felt heavier than memory when he dragged them out. Back at Raven's side, Jack crouched low. The horse's great body shivered at his presence, but made no move to fight. The trust forged moments ago still held fragile as glass. Jack unfolded the tarp, then began working it under the stallion, inch by inch. Each time the canvas brushed a wound, Raven flinched, a rumbling groan escaping his throat, but he didn't thrash. Jack whispered steady reassurance, his words. He barely heard himself. "Easy, easy. I've got you." When the tarp was finally spread beneath most of the horse's bulk, Jack threaded the rope through grommets and tied knots with quick, practiced motions. He pulled the lines taut, fashioning a crude sled. Then he stood back, aching sweat already dampening his shirt despite the morning chill. He stepped away a few paces and looked at the black mound of muscle and blood resting on the tarp. The sheer size of it made his stomach turn. He was one man, one worn-out man, and yet, if he didn't try, there would be nothing left of this animal by dawn. Jack set his jaw, grabbed the lead rope, and leaned back with everything he had. His boots dug trenches in the soil as he heaved. The tarp shifted with a screech of fabric against dirt. Raven let out a pained grunt, but the stallion moved an inch, then another. Jack staggered forward, then set his weight again. pull, breathe, pull again. His shoulders burned, his arms shook. The tarp slid only inches at a time, but each inch was stolen victory. Within minutes, his shirt clung to his, and back, soaked through. His breaths tore from him in ragged bursts. His chest AHD as if someone had set a fire inside his ribs. Still, he pulled. The tarp rasped leaves and grit catching under it. Raven shifted weakly, his breath hot and damp against the cold air. Jack risked a glance back and nearly faltered. The horse's eyes were open, following him, steady and intent. "Don't look at me like that," Jack gasped, bracing for another haul. "I'm no miracle worker." But he pulled again. The sight of those eyes refused to let faith in him stop. The forest swallowed time. Minutes became miles in Jack's mind. Each step forward was earned by pain in his shoulders, by the stabbing in his lower back, by the pounding of blood in his temples. He dragged the rope until his hands blistered, until the edges cut deep into his palms. He'd pause, gasping, bent double, then feel that gaze on him again and straighten. Keep moving. Keep moving. After perhaps 30 yards, though, it felt like a mile. Jack's legs quivered so badly he thought they might fold. He dropped the rope, fell to his knees, and pressed a shaking hand against the earth. Behind him came a sound that froze his blood. The stallion tried to rise. Raven planted. One foreleg trembled and heaved, muscles bunching like coiled steel. For a moment, impossibly, he lifted himself. Then his strength failed. His legs collapsed beneath him and he crashed, back down dust, exploding in a cloud. His great chest heaved, nostrils flaring, foam flecking his lips. Jack scrambled to his side, fear clawing at him. He pressed a hand to the thick neck, searching for a pulse. Beneath the blood-streaked coat, the beat was faint, irregular, but still there. "Maybe it's already too late," Jack whispered. The words burned his throat. He bowed his head, eyes shut tight against the rush of defeat. But when he opened them again, ravens were still there, half-lidded, dark, stubborn, alive. The stallion hadn't surrendered. Not yet. Jack let out a shaky laugh that was half sob, half defiance. "All right then. Not yet." He leaned down close, voice raw, trembling, but steady in its entente. "Come on. Just a little more. Don't quit on me now." The horse's ear twitched at the sound, a tiny flicker of acknowledgement. Then, impossibly, Raven shifted. His massive head lifted an inch. He dragged one leg forward, claws of pain etched across his body, but he moved. Jack's breath caught. He blinked hard, disbelief and awe colliding in his chest. "You've got to be kidding me," he whispered, but it was real. The stallion, broken and bleeding, was answering him. Jack lunged for the rope, seized it, and hauled with renewed force. At the same instant, Raven strained too, dragging himself across the tarp a fraction. Together, they shifted forward, more than Jack could have managed alone. Again, Jack pulled. Again, Raven answered. It was clumsy, agonizing, and slow, but it was a rhythm. Man and horse moved as one locked in a desperate pact neither could name. Jack's breath came in ragged bursts, Raven's in wheezing gasps, but they pressed forward. Every foot they gained was a miracle. Every pause threatened collapse. Yet still, they advanced until the forest itself reminded them they were not alone. It began as a single note, a long, mournful howl drifting through the trees. Jack stiffened. His spine went cold. He knew that sound every rancher, every woodsman did, a coyote's call. But then another answered, and another from different directions, closer. Jack turned sharply, roped, still in his fists. His eyes scanned the darkening tree line. Shapes lurked there in distinct shadows that shifted just out of focus. Raven's ears shot upright. The horse shuddered, head lifting weakly, nostrils flaring. His sides heaved with panic. Jack swallowed hard. His throat felt dry as dust. He yanked the rope tighter around. His wrists, as though holding it alone, could ward off what crept nearer. "Not now," he muttered under his breath, scanning the black gaps between trunks. "For God's sake, not now." The howls rose again, overlapping, weaving into a chorus. The sound pressed in from all sides. Jack's pulse hammered in his temples. He could almost feel the eyes out there, glowing in the dusk, hungry and patient. The smell of blood had traveled far. He bent close to Raven, whispering fiercely as though the horse could hear the urgency. "We've got to move, big fella. They'll be on us soon." Raven shifted, a guttural sound, rumbling in his chest. He didn't try to stand. He couldn't. But his gaze met Jack's fierce. In its weakness, night fell in pieces. First, the long shadow stretched into the hollows of the trees. Then the pale streaks of twilight drained from the argiline until only a faint purple glow clung to the west. Jack Mercer pulled at the rope in stubborn silence, dragging Raven inch by inch along the forest floor. His shirt clung to him damp with sweat that cooled too fast in the evening air. The temperature was dropping quickly now. Cold seeped down from the mountains, like an invisible tide. A low mist crept from the undergrowth and pulled in the hollows, curling around his boots. Every breath steamed in the dark. Jack's shoulders throbbed. His back screamed with every pull. But still he leaned into the rope. The tarp rasped over roots and rocks, carrying the weight of the black stallion, whose breaths were loud and labored behind him. Each inhale sounded ragged, each exhale too thin. Raven was fading, and Jack knew it. The woods had fallen eerily quiet again, as though holding its breath. Only two sounds filled the stillness: the gritty scrape of canvas sliding across dirt and the hollow weaves of the wounded horse. It should have been comforting proof that they were still moving forward, still alive. Instead, it pressed down on Jack's ears like the ticking of a clock. He paused, chest heaving. His grip on the rope trembled. He glanced back. Raven's eyes glowed faintly in what little light remained open and fixed on him, stubborn even in exhaustion. "Don't quit on me," Jack muttered voice. He spat to clear the dryness in his throat and set himself for another pull. And then he froze. Between one breath and the next, something changed. A prickle ran down his spine, the way it always had in the Menachie desert just before the ambush came. He stilled, rope taut in his hands, head-lifted ears straining. The forest had gone too quiet. He turned slowly, scanning the black wall of trees. That was when he saw them, points of light gleaming faintly between the trunks. One pair, then two, then three eyes. A chill clamped down his back, his breath caught. The first howl rose like a blade, cutting through the silence. Long, low, and mournful. It rolled across the timber, echoing from ridge to ridge, until it seemed the whole night was howling back. A second joined, then a third, until the air thrummed with hungry voices. Jack's stomach dropped. He'd heard that song before. Every rancher in Montana knew it. Coyotes made of a racket, but wolves hunted in silence until the very moment they wanted you to know you were cornered. He glanced at Raven. The stallion had stiffened ears, prick-ricked forward, nostrils flaring, wide as he sucked in the scent on the wind. His entire body trembled. Fear cut through the weakness, dragging instinct back to the surface. "They smelled the blood," Jack whispered, more to himself than the horse. His pulse hammered in his throat. He let the rope fall and stepped back, planting himself between Raven and the treeing, his boots rooted into the soil. He fumbled in his pocket with hands that shook from fatigue, but found what he needed: the old folding knife. The steel blade clicked out with a weary snick. It looked pitiful in the darkness, barely more than a shard of silver in his palm, against wolves. It might as well have been a toothpick. Still, he raised it. "Stay with me, big fella," he murmured over his shoulder. "We're not done yet." The words steadied him as much as they did the horse. He squared his shoulders, forcing his breath into a rhythm. For a moment, the forest seemed to lean inward, holding its breath. Then a shape detached itself from the blackness and came low and fast. The wolf burst from the trees like a shadow, uncoiled muscles rippling under gray fur, eyes blazing. Jack's body reacted before his mind could. He roared a raw primal sound and slashed with the knife as the shape closed in. Steel met fur with a flash of resistance. The wolf twisted mid-lunge, snapping jaws, missing his thigh by inches. It yelped at the sting of the blade, grazing its flank and skidded back, circling. Jack's chest hammered. He barely had time to register the cold, sweat rolling down his spine before the growl started. All around him, from every shadow, a chorus of teeth and hunger. He turned in a slow circle, blade-up eyes, straining into the dark. Every few seconds he caught the glint of another set of eyes. 5, 6, maybe more. Shapes slink-kecked between the trunks, circling wider, closing in behind him. Raven struggled, hooves striking weakly at the ground. He tried to rise, failed, collapsed back with a grunt. The smell of blood grew sharper in the night air. Jack clenched the knife tighter. The thought cut through him like ice. If they rush all at once, we're done. He barked a shout deep from his diaphragm, the kind of bellow that had carried across battlefields. The sound crashed through the trees. For a heartbeat, silence followed. Then the wolves answered, not by retreating, but by closing the ring. Jack's gaze whipped from side to side. Footsteps padded over Lee's claws, scraping bark. The air was thick with the musk of predators. He turned, spoon, desperate to catch every movement, but the darkness was too thick. He was nearly blind. "Come on then," he yelled, knife up, voice cracking. His heart thudded so hard it felt like it would break through his ribs. One wolf snapped from the shadow's teeth, flashing white. Jack slashed. The blade cut air as the wolf fainted back. Growls deepened, rumbling like thunder beneath. The earth. Raven let out a shrill broken whinny, thrashing against the tarp. Blood seeped faster from reopened wounds. Jack's gut twisted. The horse couldn't fight, couldn't even flee. If Jack faltered now, they'd both be torn apart. The circle tightened. Jack spun again. Knife raised. The trees swayed in the wind, but his eyes caught. Nothing clear. Only movement, only menace. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed, but he planted his boots firmer. He could feel the edge of himself, his strength, his sanity, fraying. And yet he would not step aside, not while the horse still breathed behind him. The forest pressed down, heavy and silent, except for the low chorus of growls. Seconds stretched into eternities. Every moment could be the one where the pack decided to strike. Jack shifted his stance, sweat freezing on his brow. His vision narrowed until there was nothing but the knife, the dark, and the endless eyes watching him. He had been here before in a different land on different stars, but the truth was the same. Alone, surrounded, outnumbered, fighting not just for survival, but against the pull of despair. He gritted his teeth, whispering, "Hoarsely, not tonight, not this time." The wolves crept closer. The night thickened. Jack's arm ached from holding the knife so tight, but he lifted it higher, ready for the next charge. Somewhere behind him, Raven shifted and groaned, breath rattling. Jack dared not turn to look, but the sound tethered him, anchored him. He couldn't quit. Not while those eyes still watched him. Not while the bond they had begun to forge was balanced on this razor edge. And so he stood, blade flashing, dully body, shaking with exhaustion, daring the darkness to come for them both. Jack's grip on the knife tightened until his knuckles ached shut. The circle of wolves had drawn so close now, he could smell them rank musk, sharp with hunger. One crouched low muscles, bunching yellow eyes fixed on him like fireflies lit from within. Its lips peeled back, showing teeth wet with saliva. Jack lifted the blade, his chest heaving, knowing the moment had come. "So this is it," he thought grimly. "If they hit me, Raven's finished too." The wolf sprang, Jack braced, knife angled, a heart exploding in his chest. He was ready to throw himself into the attack, to cut until his arms failed. And then the night split apart. A sound tore through the forest, so massive and thunderous that even Jack flinched. A shriek, a scream, no. A stallion's whinny deep and primal, rolling like thunder across the canyon walls. The wolf twisted midair and landed short, startled by the explosion of sound. Jack spun. Raven was rising. The stallion heaved his body off the tarp, staggering 3 legs, trembling under his own weight. The fourth barely touching. His massive head swung high, and main wild eyes blazing like twin embers in the dark. His chest heaved, blood streaking his hide, but he stood. Jack could only stare, his knife forgotten in his hand. Raven's scream shook the air. Again, reverberating like storm thunder in the mountains. The sound carried power beyond flesh, or bone. It was defiance made real, rage against death itself. The wolves faltered. The stallion's body swayed, but he drove his hindquarters around with sudden violence. Hooves lashed out, striking the night with such force the very air seemed to shudder. Dirt and stone flew in a spray. One wolf, too slow to retreat, yelped as the shockwave of the kick sent it sprawling backward into the brush. A ripple of hesitation ran through the pack. Growls faltered. The glowing eyes blinked and shifted. Jack felt the shift in his own bones. For the first time that night, the predators doubted. Raven stood like a titan carved from shadow, and moonlight battered but unbroken. The horse's breath thundered from his nostrils, fogging the cold air, and his ears pinned back in fury. Again, he screamed. Again, he lashed out, hooves slamming the ground. The earth quaked beneath him. The wolves retreated a step, then another. Their growls wavered, no longer filled with triumph, but with uncertainty. The stallion's fury had pierced their hunger. And then one by one, they began to fade into the trees. Jack watched in stunned silence as the glowing eyes winked out, swallowed by darkness. The howls that followed were different. Now, drawn out, bitter, reluctant. A pack denied its kill. The night grew still again. Jack lowered the knife slowly, as though afraid the moment might shatter if he moved too fast. His legs trembled, his body slick with cold sweat. He turned his gaze back to Raven and could hardly believe what he saw. The horse, wounded and half dead minutes ago, had driven off death itself. In that instant, Raven wasn't prey. He wasn't broken. He was something else. Something untamed and terrible and beautiful, the raw essence of the wild. Jack's chest constricted. He had been ready to die here, and instead, the animal he'd come to save had stood to save him. You! His voice cracked. He swallowed, tried. Again. You saved my damn life. Raven's head swung toward him, ears flicking. The stallion's breath rushed out hot into the night, a low snort that steamed in the air. Then his legs buckled. Jack lurched forward just as the black giant collapsed the ground and shaking under his fall. He rolled onto his side chest, rising and falling in. Shallow, labored heaves. No, no, no! Jack dropped to his knees, knife-forgotten hands reaching instinctively. He pressed a palm against the horse's thick neck, feeling for life. Beneath his fingers, the pulse thudded faint, but there. Raven's eye rolled toward him, heavy-lidded, still burning faintly, but clouded by exhaustion. Jack bent low, whispering fiercely, "Hold on, big fella. Don't give up now. You've come too far." The stallion's chest shuddered. He drew, in a harsh, rattling breath, then exhaled with a long groan. Jack kept his hand firm against the neck, as if his own will could anchor that heartbeat. "You're not quitting on me, Jack," muttered his voice, shaking. "Not after all that." But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. Raven had poured out everything he had left to scatter the wolves. What remained was a fragile thread. Jack sat back, dragging both hands over his face. His body felt hollow, drained. Yet his mind spun with frantic clarity. The truck wasn't far now, no more than 100 yards, maybe less. He could make it. He had to. He scrambled to his feet, scooped up the rope, and began retying the knots around the tarp. His fingers fumbled raw and bleeding from earlier pulls, but he worked quickly, cinching them tighter than before. He looped one end around a pine trunk to give himself leverage. "Just a little further," he muttered, echoing his earlier plea. He bent, grabbed the rope, and leaned back with all his weight. Muscles screamed, his teeth ground together. Inch by inch, the tarp scraped forward. He pulled again, veins bulging in his caul, forearms, his boots slipping in the dirt. Every jerk of progress felt like fire running through his spine. Behind him, Raven's eyes stayed open, faint, but steady, following him. That gaze burned into Jack's back, feeding him strength. He didn't know he had left. He hauled again, snarling through clenched teeth until another yard was won. Then another. The road gleamed faintly ahead through the trees, pale gravel reflecting in moonlight. The sight filled him with raw determination. "Come on," Jack growled, hauling until stars burst behind his eyes. "We're almost there." The tarp crept, the horse groaned, but the distance shrank. And then a new sound split the night. Not a howl, not claws, a deep mechanical growl. Jack froze, breath locked in his chest. From beyond the tree came the thrum of an engine, low and steady, growing louder. Headlights swung through the forest beams, slicing between trunks, cutting through the mist. Jack's stomach dropped. His pulse kicked like a drum, a pickup truck coming fast. The grinding, the roar of the truck's engine grew louder until it drowned out even the sound of Jack's ragged breathing. He planted himself in front of Raven's body rope, still clutched in his blistered hands. The stallion lay in the shadows behind him, chest rising faintly, each breath sounding like it might be the last. Jack squinted into the flood of headlights, bearing down through the trees. The pickup rolled to a halt at the edge of down, the clearing. For a long beat, only the idle rumble of its engine filled the silence. Then, a sharp crack split the night. Dirt burst into the air just a few feet from Jack's boots. He jerked back instinctively, heart slamming, a warning shot. A rough voice followed, ragged with age and whiskey. "That horse is mine. Step away, soldier." Jack's vision adjusted enough to make out the figure emerging from the truck. Eli Turner. His face was carved deep with lines and shadow, his eyes bloodshot and hard as flint. The man had been a thorn in every rancher's side for years. greedy, spiteful, always claiming what wasn't his. Tonight, his lean frame looked stretched tight over bone like hunger itself had taken human shape. A rifle sat heavy in his arms, the barrel glinting under the headlights. Jack stood tall, despite the exhaustion dragging at his bones. His body trembled, but not from fear. He had faced men like Eli before, men who thought possession was the only law that mattered. Behind him, ravens shifted weakly, a low groan, rattling in his throat. Jack moved instinctively to block the horse from sight. Eli's boots crunched on gravel as he stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "You know what that beast is worth," his voice cracked, half snarl, half plea. "More than your truck, your cabin hell. More than you'll ever be." Jack didn't move. His breath rasped in and out, but his voice came low, steady, carrying all the weight of a man who had seen enough of death. "It's dying. You shoot it, that's on your conscience." Eli barked a laugh that held no humor. "Conscience? Don't talk to me about conscience, Mercer. That horse doesn't belong to you. It doesn't belong to anyone. But I'll be damned if I let you drag it out from under my nose." Jack felt the rope bite into his blistered palms. He shifted his stance, shoulders squared, the battered outline of a man refusing to bend. "Then you'll have to go through me first." For a moment, silence thickened, heavier than smoke. The two men stood locked in a standoff, headlights casting long shadows across their faces. Raven's breathing filled the pause like a drumbeat of inevitability. Eli's expression hardened. He raised the rifle, the black mouth of the barrel aligning with Jack's chest. Jack's hand drifted slowly to his pocket, feeling the shape of his folding knife. It was laughable, the idea of a blade against a gun, but he couldn't stand empty-handed. His breath came shallow, heart hammering. The world shrank into a tunnel. The barrel, the trigger, the slight tightening of Eli's knuckles. Jack's mind flashed back to another battlefield. Another night when rifles rose from the dark and friends fell like wheat. He'd sworn never to freeze again, never, to watch helplessly. And then a sound, weak but cutting, through the tension like a plea. Raven whinnied. It was broken, strained, but alive. The noise snapped through Jack's chest. He locked eyes with Eli, refusing to flinch. He would not step aside, not this time. For a heartbeat, the world hung on a knife edge. Then new light split the clearing. Another engine, smaller but steady. A jeep. Eli twisted rifle, wavering. The beams illuminated the sheriff's insignia on the door before the vehicle even stopped. Dust kicked up as the jeep braked hard. Sheriff Nora Blake stepped out, her boots striking the dirt with a finality that silenced even the insects. Her voice cut through the night. "Drop the gun, Eli. Now." Eli stiffened, jaw tightening. "This is my land," he shot back, though his voice carried more bluster than conviction. "That horse belongs to me." Nora's hand rested casually on the grip of her sidearm, but her eyes were steel. She moved forward to pace, her badge catching the glow of headlights. "That horse is federal property. Injured wildlife is under my jurisdiction. You shoot it, and I'll have you in cuffs before the sun comes up." The barrel of Eli's rifle wavered. For a moment, Jack thought the man might actually pull the trigger out of sheer stubborn spite. Then Eli spat into the dirt, a guttural sound. He lowered the rifle slowly, reluctantly, his face twisted with rage. His eyes found Jack's burning. "This isn't over, Mercer. That beast will never be yours." He turned, stomped back to his truck, and with a roar of the engine, tore away into the night, leaving only the bitter stench of exhaust and gunpowder. The silence that followed felt louder than the confrontation. Jack sagged slightly, the adrenaline draining from his limbs until he could barely keep upright. He leaned one hand on the rope, the other pressed against his thigh to steady himself. Nora walked closer, her gaze sweeping over the bloodied stallion sprawled on the tarp before lifting to Jack's face. Her expression was a mixture of exasperation and reluctant respect. "You should have called me Jack," she said flatly. "You could have been killed." Jack let out a rough laugh that caught in his throat. He swiped a sleeve across his sweat-soaked face. If I'd left him, he'd already be dead. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then Nora sighed, tilting her head slightly. "All right then, let's get him out of here." Jack nodded once. His arms trembled as he bent to secure the rope again, but he forced his body to obey. Nora crouched opposite him, looping the line carefully through the winch on his old pickup. The truck groaned to life, its tired engine humming as the cable tightened. The tarp lurched, dragging Raven inch by painful inch toward the bed. The horse groaned blood trickling fresh from reopened cuts, but he didn't fight. He lay still, trusting the humans who surrounded him. Jack guided the tarp as the winch, strained his body, hovering close, murmuring steady encouragements. "Almost there, big fella. Stay with me." The steel cables sang under the tension, whining as the tarp scraped higher. Jack's muscles screamed to help, but the mechanical pull carried most of the weight now. Nora steadied the horse's massive shoulders as best she could, her boots braced wide. At last, with one final grind of gears, Raven slid fully into the bed of the truck. His body collapsed against the metal, chest heaving, heading weakly to the side. Jack stumbled back, rope falling from his raw hands. His knees buckled, but he caught himself against the side of the truck. For a moment, he could only stand there, shaking, staring at the animal he had dragged from death's door again and again. Relief crashed over him so fiercely it nearly toppled him. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, chest aching, eyes stinging. Nora laid a steady hand on his shoulder. "Go," she said quietly, her voice softer. "Now, I'll clear the way." Jack nodded, unable to find words. He staggered toward the driver's seat, his every muscle screaming in protest, but his resolve sharper than ever. Behind him, Raven shifted faintly in the bed, his breath weak but steady. The night wasn't done testing them, but for now, for this fragile moment, they had survived. Jack climbed behind the wheel with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The cab smelled of sweat and pine and old oil. The seat springs pressed through the fabric as if to remind him this truck had lived more lives than it had a right to. He turned the key. The engine coughed, shuddered, and finally caught. Headlights flared across the trees and threw the night backward in two dirty cones. He checked the rear-view mirror. The black bulk of the horse filled the bed of fallen mountain wrapped in tarp and rope. Raven didn't move, didn't even twitch an ear. Only the faint rise and fall of his chest proved he was still here, still, fighting. Jack's mouth went dry. "Stay with me, big fella," he said, voice no more than a rasp. "Don't you quit now." He dropped the truck into gear and pressed the accelerator. Gravel rattled. The back end sued, then bit. The old pickup lunged forward, bumping onto the narrow road that unspooled, through the timber like a scar. Night swallowed the track just beyond the headlights. Where the beams ended, the world ended. The road climbed and fell without mercy. A ladder of ruts and potholes chiseled into the mountain. Every dip made the plang. Frame groan, and the tie, down straps creak. Jack flinched each time the suspension bottomed out, imagining the jolt rippling through Raven's body. "Easy," he muttered to the truck, as if it could hear him. "To the horse," he said, almost there, though he didn't know how far there really was. Wind knifed through the crack in the window. He hadn't realized the glass no longer sealed right. It made a lonely whistle like air escaping a wound. The sound skittered down his spine. He gripped the wheel tighter and pushed the speedometer past the number he usually promised himself he wouldn't cross on these roads. The tires hit a washboard stretch and the whole vehicle shivered, bolts complaining as if they might loosen and fall away. In the mirror, Raven's chest fluttered. The stallion's head lolled to one side, an ear flattened by gravity. Jack kept glancing back and dragging his gaze forward again, road mirror road, until his eyes ached. He wanted to talk just to fill the silence, to anchor the living thing in the bed to the world by a line of words. "Stay with me, big fella. Don't you quit now." The phrase became a cadence, a rope he threw backward again and again. He thought about calling ahead. His battered phone lay in the cup holder with a cracked screen and a battery that died when the temperature dropped. No bars. Even if there had been, what would he say? "I have a dying wild horse in my truck and a heart that won't slow down." He pressed the gas a little harder. The track pitched into a switchback. Beyond the guardless edge, the valley fell away into a darkness that seemed to have weight. Jack took the corner too fast and felt the tires slide sideways over loose rock. He eased off the throttle and the truck corrected with a shudder. In the rear view, Raven's chest hitched and stilled. Jack's own breath turned ragged. "I know," he said. "I know." The voice that came out of him belonged to someone older. "I'm sorry. I should have called sooner. Should have brought help right away." Guilt ran through him like a wire. If he'd done anything different, would the horse be stronger now? The truck rattled over a pothole, and the thought seemed to rattle loose with it. Useless. Only the next mile mattered. Miles. Unspooled. The forest thinned. The wind rose and slashed through the headlights. and translucent sheets. The mountain road spat them at last onto a wider county route as pale as bone under the moon. Jack never took his foot off the gas. Gravel gave way to broken asphalt, then to asphalt smooth enough that the tires hummed instead of growled. The speedometer climbed. Every minute shaved from the drive felt like a minute wrung back from death. He checked the mirror again. Raven's chest still moved. In the glow, the bandages he'd hastily pressed along the worst of the cuts had darkened. The horse lay as if the truck were a raft, and he had washed up on it. Jack swallowed and leaned forward in the seat, as if he could push the truck faster by will alone. The town's edge appeared at last, as a scatter of sodium lights and dark rooftops. He blew past the shuttered diner and the lonely gas station, with its pump handles zip-tied for the night. The road straightened toward the industrial district, where the county kept its plows and salt domes, and where, beyond them, a rectangle of buildings sat in a hollow of trees with a floodlight over its lot. The sign caught the beams and flashed white letters. Wildlife. Rescue station. Jack brake hard. The truck slid half a car length and stopped. Skewed across the entrance engine, ticking like a cooling stove. He threw the door open and fell out more than climbed, knees jolting. The floodlight painted the world in hard edges. "Hey!" he yelled, his voice cracking with urgency. "Hey, need help?" The station door banged open. 2 techs in scrubs and canvas jackets jogged out. Then a third older, steadier with a stethoscope looped around her neck. Their conversation died as their eyes leapt to the bed of the truck, and the horse laid out their huge and ruined bandages bleeding through. "Jesus," the older one said. Her gaze snapped to Jack. "What happened, Wire?" he croaked. "Barbed wire. He's hurt bad. Wire cuts. He won't last long. Sedation fluids, the big sling. Move." The vet's voice shifted to command, and the station sprang to life. One tech ran inside and came back with an armful of gear. A kit bag, a coil of straps, a lantern. The other was already backing the station's flatbed to the ramp gate. Jack fumbled with the chain at his truck's tailgate. His fingers felt thick and clumsy. The metal clattered as it came free. "Let them work," another voice said behind him, lower, steadier. Sheriff Nora Blake stepped into the floodlight circle with a palm that felt like a hand on the chaos. He hadn't seen her pull in. Maybe she'd followed him without him noticing. She rested a palm on his shoulder. "You did good getting here. Now let them work." He wanted to move anyway, to do anything that kept him from standing and counting his own heartbeats. He managed to nod and stepped back 2 paces, then 1 forward again before he stopped. The vet climbed onto the bumper with a syringe between her fingers. She pressed it into a vein with a tenderness Jack hadn't known you could show through latex gloves. "Just a little. I don't want you too deep," she murmured to Raven, as if he were a patient with a name and a story. And maybe now he was. They looped the wide sling under the horse, the canvas straps darkening as they touched blood and sweat. A portable and hoist hummed and lifted, straining as sidelong muscles were asked to surrender their weight. Raven made a sound so tired it barely counted as a protest. The texts maneuvered, counted, lifted. Again. The horse swayed in the air, huge and helpless, and then settled onto the pavement. Stretcher with a soft thunder. "Inside," the vet said. The stretcher. Wheels squealed and bounced. Jack followed until Nora's hand applied. A gentle pressure that stopped him at the threshold. "Let them work," she repeated. The door swung closed. The lock snicked. The sound left Jack in the quiet lobby, with nothing but the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant clatter of instruments, trays, metal-running feet. The smells changed back here. Disinfectant iodine soap. The copper of blood that followed on the tech's clothes. The floodlight's harsh white gave way to the smallness of a waiting room lamp. He sank into a plastic chair. His body took its shape like cooling lead. Sweat dried on his skin until he shivered. He realized he had never been this tired, at least not since a different life, when soldiers had. Watched the sun rise and cursed it for doing so over the dead. Across from him, on a bulletin board, children's crayon drawings of foxes and owls fluttered faintly with the movement of the air. Someone had left a magazine on the table. Its pages were dog-eared. He stared at it without seeing anything. Muffled through the door, a horse made a low, broken sound. Jack flinched. He pressed his fingers into his knees until they hurt. "Don't. Let me lose him too," he said to no one to the room. To the God he hadn't spoken to in years. His voice felt like it came from the bottom of a well. "Don't, please." Time unspooled sideways. Sometimes it was a minute, sometimes it was a decade. He remembered a canvas tent lit from the inside by lantern light, a medic's hands moving quickly in the heat, the dust on, everything. He remembered the way a man's breath could sound like tearing paper when the body was deciding whether to keep it. He remembered how it felt to walk out alone into air that smelled of diesel and sand and know that a life had gone where he could not follow it. The door opened once. A tech with freckles and serious eyes passed through with a bag of fluids and didn't meet Jack's gaze because she was holding her own together. The door thudded closed again. The clock on the wall ticked. The second hand made a click each time it moved, and each click sounded like a pin being pulled from inside him. Nora sat down, 2 chairs over. She didn't speak for a while. She sipped coffee that steamed in, the sharp light, and watched the closed door with him. Finally, she said, not unkindly, you should have called for help. The rebuke was a fact, not a lash. I know, he said. The admission came out soft. If I'd left him, he'd be dead. He stared at his hands, palms, blistered blood in the creases. I couldn't just walk away. Nora nodded once. No, she said quietly. I don't reckon you could. Footsteps beyond the door, quick and purposeful. A clink of forceps, the muted beep of a monitor starting up. Jack let the sounds be a kind of liturgy. He tried to count them into meaning. He failed. He lowered his head, forearms on his thighs, and stared at the floor until the tile pattern blurred and swam. When he blinked, his eyes burned. He didn't sleep. He drifted somewhere between this room and a place with a horse's breath in it. The door finally opened with a soft rush, as if the room exhaled. The lead vet stepped out, mask hanging at ruments. Her throat, hair damp at the temples, fatigue etched in the lines around her mouth. She didn't make them wait. He's a fighter, she said, just that first, like a verdict. Jack's whole body leaned toward her. We cleaned and stitched the wounds, she continued, not wasting the attention she had. He lost a lot of blood, but he's stable for now. Fluids are going. We're warming him, watching for shock. A half smile flickered, wary, cautious, hopeful. If he makes it through the night, his chances are good. So Jack's voice cracked. He cleared it, tried again. So, he's gonna make it. The vet nodded. He has a chance, she said. And sometimes, that's everything. All the air that had been locked in, Jack's chest fled him at once. He had to grab the edge of the chair to keep from sliding to the floor. He shut his eyes and saw the road, the wolves, the knife, the hooves. When he opened them again, the room had edges. His hands were his hands. Thank you, he managed. Don't thank me yet, the vet said. But she allowed the ghost of her smile to stay. Rest if you can. We'll come get you if anything changes. He didn't rest. He stood when she left and paced 3 yards one way, 3 yards back. Saturday. He stood again. Eventually, a tech, maybe the same one with the freckles, maybe not, brought him a paper cup of water. He drank it as if water had just been invented. The night crept toward morning with stubborn slowness. The window over the lobby desk palled by degrees you couldn't see unless you stared long enough to make your eyes sting. Jack watched it change the way shipwrecked sailors watch the line of the horizon for sails. At some point, Nora left and returned with another coffee. She placed it by his elbow and didn't ask if he wanted it. He didn't. He wrapped his hands around the heat. Anyway, dawn came. It seeped into the building as a soft gold wash that lifted the gray and made the white paint look less like surrender. A tech opened the door and beckoned. You can see him now, she said. Jack stood too fast, and the blood left his head. He steadied himself on the chair back and followed the tech down a more corridor that smelled of antiseptic and faintly of hay. They passed kennels where bandaged raccoons blinked slow in the half-light, an owl in a quiet crate that turned its head like a planet. At the end of the hall, a larger stall waited, rubber, matted floor, heat lamps, monitors. The air was warm. Raven lay there, big, even in a big space. White bandages swaddled his chest and 4-leg gauze layered where blood had washed him before. His sides moved in strong, measured counts now instead of frantic snatches. An ivy line climbed to a bag that glowed, amber in the light. The stallion's eyes were closed. Jack approached the gate as if it led to a church. His hand found the cool metal of the bars. He stood there a long second, just looking. Raven's eyelids fluttered, slowly, with the reluctant grace of the exhausted. He opened them. Dark brown met Jack's gray-blue. The horse's nostrils fluttered. Once, he drew in a breath and let out a soft, low sound, barely a note more. Vibration, then voice. It was not a demand or a fear. It was acknowledgement. Jack swallowed. Something thick climbed up his throat and made speech feel like glass. He placed his fingers against the bar, then slid them down the cool iron like he might touch the animal without pressing on wounds. "Good to see you awake, partner," he said. The word partner felt right. Raven's ear angled lazily toward the sound. His eye, half-lidded, stayed on Jack. The stallion breathed out again, a hush more than a whicker, and Jack closed his eyes because if he didn't, the room might tilt, and he might have to sit down or do something else foolish, like cry. Footsteps behind him. Nora, coffee and hand hair pulled back under a cap she'd put on sometime during the endless night. "You should have called for help," she said. The words were the same as before, but softer, reshaped by dawn. "But you did the right thing." Jack turned. He must have looked wrecked, shirt-stained, beard shadow, dark eyes red at the rims. He didn't try to hide any of it. "If I hadn't, he'd be dead," he said. "I couldn't just walk away." Nora studied him for a beat, then nodded once. "Well, thanks to you, he's still breathing." The vet appeared long enough to check the monitors and adjust the drip. She remarked without looking up, "He's stubborn. That helps." Then she vanished down the hall again, trailing competence like a wake. Jack stayed by the gate until his legs told him he had to shift or fall. He didn't, either. He simply leaned into the bars and let the heat from the lamps breathe into his skin. Time thinned. He knew he would have to go soon. The station would keep Raven. Regulations and sense required it. Besides, the horse needed more than one man with a rope and a truck could give. But the thought of stepping away pressed on Jack's ribs. So he did what he could with the selfish minutes left and memorized small things. The way Raven's lashes were tipped in dust, the pale crescent of an old scar at his shoulder blade, the steadiness of the breath, under bandage. "Take care, big fella," Jack said at last. The words rough because they had to push through, everything in the way. "You've got a second chance now." He straightened fingers slipping from the iron. He turned toward the door. His boots made a hush on the rubber mat. He had taken 2 steps when the sound cut through the warm air behind him. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be a low trilling, almost conversational. Whinny short certain, a goodbye. Jack stopped. The room tipped and steadied around him. For a heartbeat, he stood there with his eyes closed to make the moment longer. Then he smiled, a small, exhausted, immeasurable thing, and looked back. Raven's eye watched him, not pleading now, not asking, acknowledging. "Go on," it seemed to say. "I'll be here when you come back. Or I won't. Either way, you did your part." Jack nodded once the soldiers goodbye. He hadn't been able to make all those years ago. "See you around," he said, and this time, his voice didn't break. The corridor felt different on the way out, as if the building had lifted off its foundation by a fraction of an inch. In the lobby, sunlight had finally found its way through the high window, poured a stripe of gold across the floor. Dust motes danced there like shaking glitter. He pushed through the glass door. Morning met him with a chill that didn't bite as hard as the night had. Sunlight spilled over the ridge and ran down the pines in sheets. The gravel lot glittered with dew. The mountains, those old, indifferent witnesses, wore bands of light and shadow-like sashes. Jack stepped into it and drew a breath so deep his ribs protested. The air filled Jack's lungs like it hadn't in years, sharp and clean, cutting through the weight he'd carried like old armor. The ghosts were still there, but for once they felt set down beside him instead of shackled to his back. He walked slower toward the truck than he had in months, every step lighter, as if gravity itself had eased its grip. The bed of the pickup was empty now, just rope, tarp, and the faint stains where another life had almost ended. He brushed his hand across the tailgate, closing it gently, the way you'd tuck in a tired friend. Nora leaned against her Jeep, coffee in hand, watching him without hiding it. She raised the cup in a quiet salute. He answered with a bare hand raised, almost a smile. "You going home?" she asked. "I don't know," Jack said, and it startled him how true that was. "Then don't disappear," Nora replied softly. "Their code, their warning, their promise." He nodded, climbed into the cab, and turned the key. The engine coughed awake on the second try, settling into a low rumble that shook the cracked mirror. Sunlight crawled across the hood, brightening metal that hadn't caught fire in years. For the first time in forever, Jack didn't feel saved. Salvation was too clean, too sudden a word. But he did feel changed in a way that couldn't be taken back. He had cut wire, he had faced teeth, he had dragged life back from the edge. But somewhere between the night's terror and the morning's quiet, the mercy had shifted. The black horse hadn't just survived. It had stood up for him in the dark, in his silence, in the places no one else could reach. The road ahead forked toward town, or away from it. Jack chose a way. The mist burned off, the sky cracked open in a blaze of blue, and cold mountain air rushed through the window like a blessing. For the first time in years, he wanted to step into the day, not just survive it. He didn't know what waited down that road. He didn't need to. He only knew he wasn't alone anymore. But as he crested the bend, his eyes caught movement in the rearview mirror. A black shape, limping yet determined, breaking free from the stall where it should have been resting. The stallion, wild, scarred, unstoppable, was following. Jack's breath caught. His hands tightened on the wheel. The world hadn't just given him a reason to live. It had given him a shadow that refused to let him go back to who he was. And somewhere deep in his chest, the soldier understood. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun.